In the summer of 1940, as German panzer divisions rolled through the streets of Paris and the Luftwaffe darkened the skies over Britain, a peculiar problem emerged in the boardrooms of Coca-Cola Deutschland. The most American of all beverages, the drink that had become synonymous with 20th century capitalism and freedom, found itself trapped behind the Iron Curtain of Nazi Germany. The syrup could no longer flow across the Atlantic. The ingredients were impossible to obtain. And yet, the bottling plants remained, the workers stood ready, and the Third Reich was thirsty. What happened next would create one of history's most unsettling corporate paradoxes. A soft drink born in the darkness of fascism that would outlive the regime that spawned it, spreading across the globe to become a symbol of carefree youth and sunny Mediterranean beaches. This is the story of Fanta. But to understand how a beverage could emerge from the heart of Nazi Germany, we must first journey backward, to the very origins of the soft drink industry itself, to the birth of Coca-Cola, and to the complex web of global commerce that would become entangled in the machinery of total war. Our story begins not in Berlin, but in Atlanta, Georgia, in the spring of 1886. The American South was still recovering from the devastation of the Civil War when John Stith Pemberton, a Confederate veteran and morphine-addicted pharmacist, stood over a brass kettle in his backyard, stirring a dark, fragrant liquid that would change the world. Pemberton had been searching for a cure for his own addiction, a patent medicine that might ease the chronic pain from the saber wound he'd received at the Battle of Columbus. What he created instead was a syrup made from coca leaves, cola nuts, sugar, and a secret blend of oils and extracts. On May 8, 1886, Pemberton carried a jug of his syrup to Jacob's Pharmacy in downtown Atlanta. The pharmacist mixed it with carbonated water, and the first glass of Coca-Cola was sold for 5 cents. Pemberton's bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, penned the flowing Spencerian script that would become the most recognizable logo in human history. But Pemberton, sick and struggling with debt, would never see his creations triumph. He sold portions of his business to various partners, and by 1888 the majority of the company had fallen into the hands of Asa Griggs Candler, a fellow pharmacist with an eye for opportunity. Candler was a man of obsessive vision. He bought out the remaining stakeholders, securing complete ownership of Coca-Cola by 1891 for a total investment of about $2,300, perhaps the most profitable business acquisition in history. Candler understood something that Pemberton had not. This was not a medicine. This was a product that could be sold to everyone, everywhere, forever. He removed the cocaine from the formula by 1903 as public sentiment turned against the drug, but kept the name and the mystique. He advertised relentlessly, plastering Coca-Cola signs on barns and buildings across America, distributing free drink coupons, and creating a marketing machine that transformed a regional curiosity into a national phenomenon. By the turn of the century, Coca-Cola was being sold in every American state. The distinctive contoured glass bottle, designed in 1915 by the Root Glass Company of Terre Haute, Indiana, made the product instantly recognizable even in the dark or when shattered on the ground. The company's lawyers had requested a bottle so distinctive that a person could recognize it by feel in the dark or lying broken on the ground. The designers, inspired by the shape of a cocoa pod, a botanical confusion with the coca leaf, created an icon. But America, for all its growing industrial might, was still just one market. The 20th century would demand something far more ambitious. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the world was being stitched together by steel and steam. Telegraph cables lay across ocean floors. Railroads connected distant continents. The great European empires, British, French, German, Ottoman, stretched across the globe, creating networks of trade and communication that made true international commerce possible for the first time in human history. And Coca-Cola, now under the leadership of Asa Candler and later Robert Woodruff, saw in this interconnected world an infinite opportunity. The First World War, that cataclysmic bloodletting that consumed Europe from 1914 to 1918, paradoxically became Coca-Cola's first great international marketing campaign. American soldiers, the doughboys who arrived in France in 1917 to tip the balance of the war, carried with them a thirst for the familiar. The company arranged to supply Coca-Cola to American military bases in France, and European civilians, exhausted by years of rationing and death, tasted the sweet American beverage and wanted more. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, and the Treaty of Versailles redrew the map of Europe, Coca-Cola remained. In 1920, the company established its first international bottling operations in Cuba, Panama, and France. In 1926, Coca-Cola arrived in Germany. The German market presented unique opportunities and challenges. This was Weimar Germany, a nation humiliated by defeat, crushed by reparations, suffering through hyperinflation so severe that workers were paid twice a day so they could rush to spend their money before it became worthless. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. Money was burned for heat. Children played with stacks of worthless bills. Yet even in this chaos, commerce persisted. The German people, sophisticated and industrious, had a taste for carbonated beverages. They had their own traditions. Mineral waters from ancient spas, fruit-flavored sodas, beer gardens where life's troubles could be drowned in steins of lager. But Coca-Cola offered something new, American modernity, a taste of the future, a small, affordable luxury that transcended class. The company opened bottling plants in Essen and Berlin. Sales grew steadily through the 1920s as Germany began its fragile recovery. The man who would become central to our story arrived on this scene in 1929. His name was Max Keith. Max Keith was born in 1903 in Mecklenburg, in northern Germany, to a family of modest means. He served briefly in the German Navy toward the end of World War I, too late to see combat, but early enough to absorb the bitterness of defeat. He was ambitious, meticulous, and possessed an almost fanatical work ethic. In 1929, he joined Coca-Cola's German operation as a salesman. He was 26 years old, and he had found his calling. Keith rose quickly through the ranks. He understood the German market intuitively. He knew how to navigate the complex bureaucracies, how to appeal to both working-class consumers and the educated bourgeoisie. By 1933, the year that would change Germany forever, Keith had become the head of Coca-Cola's German office. He was in the right place at the right moment, though what that moment would bring could not have been fully imagined by anyone alive. On January 30, 1933, Paul von Hindenburg, the aging president of the Weimar Republic, made a decision that would lead to the deaths of tens of millions of people. He appointed Adolf Hitler, the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, as Chancellor of Germany. Hitler had spent the previous decade building a movement from the wreckage of Germany's post-war despair. a toxic blend of racial supremacy, violent nationalism, anti-Semitism, and promises of restored German greatness. His brown-shirted stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung, had brawled in the streets with communists and socialists. His speeches, delivered with hypnotic fury, blamed Germany's troubles on a conspiracy of Jews, Marxists, and the Western powers who had dictated the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. Within weeks of taking power, Hitler began dismantling German democracy. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, likely set by the Nazis themselves, provided the pretext for emergency decrees that suspended civil liberties. The Enabling Act of March 1933 gave Hitler dictatorial powers. Opposition parties were banned. Trade unions were destroyed. Books were burned in massive public bonfires. The first concentration camp opened at Dachau in March 1933, initially for political prisoners, communists, socialists, anyone who dared resist. And through all of this upheaval, Coca-Cola continued to operate in Germany. This was not unusual. Many American companies maintained German operations throughout the 1930s: Ford, General Motors, IBM, Standard Oil. The Nazi regime, despite its revolutionary rhetoric, needed international commerce to rebuild Germany's economy and rearm its military. American corporations, for their part, saw Germany as a lucrative market. The Nazis were anti-communist, which American business leaders appreciated. They brought order and stability after the chaos of Weimar. They were, in the sanitized language of corporate boardrooms, good for business. Max Keith understood that to succeed in Nazi Germany, Coca-Cola Deutschland would need to accommodate itself to the regime. He joined the Nazi Party. This was not mandatory for business leaders, but it was certainly helpful. It opened doors, smoothed negotiations, demonstrated loyalty to the new order. There is no evidence that Keith was an ideological Nazi, no record of him participating in the regime's worst atrocities. But he was a pragmatist, a company man, and he saw which way the wind was blowing. Under Keith's leadership, Coca-Cola's German operation flourished. He expanded the bottling network, opened new plants, and launched aggressive marketing campaigns that associated the American drink with the new Germany. Coca-Cola sponsored the 1936 Berlin Olympics, the massive propaganda spectacle that Hitler used to showcase Nazi achievements to the world. German athletes sipped Coca-Cola while Hitler watched from his box, and the world's press captured it all on camera. Sales in Germany increased from 243,000 cases in 1933, 4.5 million cases in 1939. Coca-Cola was everywhere, in cafes and restaurants, at Hitler Youth rallies, in Wehrmacht canteens. Then came September 1, 1939, when German tanks rolled across the Polish border and the Second World War began. Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days after the invasion of Poland, honoring their guarantees to the Polish state. But this was not 1914. There were no massive offensives, no immediate bloodbaths in the trenches. Instead, the Western Front settled into the phony war, a period of eerie quiet while Germany consolidated its conquest of Poland, and the French and British armies sat behind the Maginot Line, waiting. For Coca-Cola Deutschland, the war's immediate impact was manageable. Trade between Germany and the United States had not yet been severed. Raw materials could still be obtained through neutral countries, but the situation was precarious. The British naval blockade was tightening. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, and in April 1940, the phony war ended with stunning brutality. Hitler unleashed Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Denmark and Norway, on April 9, 1940. Both nations fell within weeks. Then, on May 10, German forces invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely. Within days, German panzer divisions had broken through the Ardennes forest terrain the French military had considered impassable for tanks, and were racing toward the English Channel. The French army, the largest in Europe, collapsed in confusion. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk, evacuated in a desperate rescue operation that saved 338,000 men, but left all their equipment behind. On June 14, 1940, German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. France, the great power that had dominated European affairs for centuries, surrendered 8 days later. Hitler personally dictated the armistice terms in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. It was an act of calculated humiliation, and it worked. Germany now controlled virtually all of Western Europe. Only Britain remained, isolated and defiant across the Channel. For Max Keith and Coca-Cola Deutschland, France's fall was catastrophic. The United States, while still officially neutral, was now the last major democracy not under Nazi occupation. President Franklin Roosevelt had begun supplying Britain with weapons and supplies through increasingly generous interpretations of neutrality laws. American public opinion was turning decisively against Germany. And most critically for Keith, the supply chain was severed. Coca-Cola's secret formula, Merchandise 7X, as it was known internally, was produced only in Atlanta and shipped to international bottling plants as a concentrated syrup. With the Atlantic now a war zone and American-German relations deteriorating by the day, those shipments stopped. The German bottling plants had some reserves, but they would not last long. Keith faced a stark choice: shut down operations, laying off thousands of workers and abandoning the market share Coca-Cola had spent decades building, or find an alternative. Keith chose the alternative. In the autumn of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged overhead, German bombers pounding London while RAF fighters desperately tried to hold them off, Max Keith assembled his team in Berlin. The problem was both simple and seemingly impossible. They needed to create a soft drink using only materials available in wartime Germany. Sugar was strictly rationed. Exotic flavors and ingredients were unobtainable. The formula would have to use whatever scraps German agriculture and industry could provide. The team Keith assembled included chemists, food technicians, and flavor specialists who had previously worked on Coca-Cola production. They began experimenting with whatever they could find. The abundance of the ingredient would be key. It had to be something Germany produced in sufficient quantities that even wartime rationing wouldn't completely eliminate it. The answer came from an unexpected source: the German food industry's waste products. Germany, cut off from international trade, was discovering the limits of autarky, economic self-sufficiency. The Nazi regime had proclaimed that Germany could survive on its own resources, but reality was proving more complicated. Food was being rationed. Exotic imports had vanished, but certain domestic industries still produced waste materials that could potentially be repurposed. Apple fiber pomace, the pulpy residue left over from cider production, was abundant. Whey, the liquid byproduct of cheese making, was plentiful. These were the scraps of German agriculture, usually fed to animals or discarded. Keith's team began their experiments. They mixed apple fiber with whey. They added whatever sugars could be obtained, beet sugar primarily, as Germany grew vast quantities of sugar beets. They experimented with different carbonation levels. They tested flavor combinations, trying to create something that would appeal to German taste while being fundamentally different from Coca-Cola. They could not replicate the cola flavor even if they wanted to. The ingredients simply did not exist in blockaded Germany. After numerous trials, they developed a formula. It was orange-flavored, vaguely fruity, sweet, but not overwhelmingly so. It was nothing like Coca-Cola, but it was drinkable, and crucially, it could be produced entirely from materials available in the Third Reich. Now they needed a name. The naming occurred during a creative meeting of Keith's staff. He challenged his team to let their imagination, their fantasy, run wild in suggesting a name. One of his salesmen, Joe Nip, shouted out Fanta. It was a stroke of accidental genius. Short, memorable, international sounding without being obviously English or American. The name suggested fantasy, fun, something light and carefree in a world darkening by the day. Fanta went into production in 1941. The timing could not have been more significant. This was the year Germany invaded the Soviet Union, launching Operation Barbarossa on June 22, the largest military operation in human history, with 3.8 million Axis troops pouring across the border. This was the year the Holocaust began in earnest, as Einsatzgruppen death squads followed the Wehrmacht eastward, murdering hundreds of thousands of Jews in pits and ravines. This was the year Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the war and transforming the conflict into a truly global catastrophe. And in this same year, Germans were drinking a new soft drink called Fanta. The success of Fanta was immediate and somewhat surprising. Germans, facing increasing austerity as the war consumed more and more of the nation's resources, embraced the new beverage. It was affordable, it was available, and it represented a small moment of pleasure in a world of rationing, blackouts, and the ever-present fear of Allied bombing raids. Fanta became the drink of Nazi Germany, but its uses extended beyond mere refreshment. Max Keith, ever the clever businessman, found additional markets for his product. German housewives, struggling with severe food rationing, discovered that Fanta could be used as a soup base, adding flavor to otherwise bland vegetable broths. It could sweeten desserts when sugar was unavailable. The drink became a staple of creative wartime cooking, a way to make the unpalatable slightly more bearable. Keith kept Coca-Cola's German bottling operation running throughout the war. The same factories that had produced Coca-Cola now produced Fanta. The same distribution networks reached across the Reich. And as Germany's empire expanded, conquering Yugoslavia, Greece, Norway, much of North Africa, Fanta followed. It was sold in occupied territories, consumed by German soldiers and civilians alike. The relationship between Coca-Cola's American headquarters and its German subsidiary during these years remains one of the more controversial aspects of the company's history. Official company accounts maintain that Coca-Cola had no contact with its German operation during the war, that the German subsidiary operated independently under the emergency conditions of wartime. Max Keith, in this telling, was essentially running his own company, cut off from Atlanta by the circumstances of war. But the reality was more complex. Switzerland remained neutral throughout the conflict, and American companies often maintained Swiss offices that could communicate with both sides. There is evidence of limited contact, of Keith sending reports through circuitous routes, of the American parent company being aware, at least in general terms, of what was happening in Germany. The full truth remains somewhat murky, obscured by destroyed records, fading memories, and the corporate desire to maintain a sanitized official history. What is undeniable is that Fanta kept Coca-Cola's German assets intact during the war. The bottling plants continued operating. The workforce remained employed. The distribution network survived. From a purely business perspective, it was a masterpiece of corporate survival. From a moral perspective, it was a company profiting from Nazi Germany while the regime carried out the worst genocide in human history. By 1943, Germany's situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The surrender at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked the turning point on the Eastern Front. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July opened the war in southern Europe. The Allied bombing campaign intensified, with RAF bombers pounding German cities by night and American B-17s striking by day. Hamburg was destroyed in Operation Gomorrah, a firestorm that killed 42,000 civilians in a single week. Berlin, Cologne, Dresden, all were reduced to rubble. The Nazi regime became increasingly desperate and barbaric. The deportation of Jews to death camps continued with industrial efficiency even as Germany's military situation collapsed. The camps themselves, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sababa, Belzec, were factories of death, using poison gas and bullets to murder millions. The Wehrmacht drafted children and old men in a final, futile attempt to hold back the Soviet and Allied armies. Hitler ordered the destruction of Germany itself through his Nero decree, demanding that everything of value be demolished rather than fall into enemy hands. Through all of this, Fanta production continued, though in ever-diminishing quantities as supplies dried up. The drink was available in bunkers as Berlin burned. German soldiers carried it to the crumbling fronts. It was, in its own small way, a witness to the apocalypse. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the shattered streets of Berlin. Soviet artillery was pounding the city to rubble. The Red Army was blocks away. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. 3 months later, after atomic bombs devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered, and the Second World War, the most destructive conflict in human history, finally ended. The Allied powers divided Germany into occupation zones. The Soviets controlled the East. The Americans, British, and French divided the West. Berlin itself, deep in the Soviet zone, was split into 4 sectors. The physical devastation was beyond comprehension. 30% of German housing destroyed, most major cities reduced to skeletal ruins, tens of millions dead across Europe, the continent's Jewish population nearly annihilated. Max Keith had survived. His factories, while damaged, were mostly intact, and crucially, he still controlled Coca-Cola's German operation. When representatives from Coca-Cola's American headquarters finally arrived in Germany in 1945, they found Keith waiting for them with detailed records of everything that had happened during the war. He had kept meticulous accounts, maintained the company's assets, and preserved its market position. He had also accumulated significant profits from Fanta sales. The question of what to do with Fanta, and with Max Keith, was delicate. The drink had been created by and for Nazi Germany. It was tainted by association with the regime. Keith himself had been a Nazi Party member. Yet he had also preserved Coca-Cola's German operations intact, an impressive feat of business management under impossible circumstances. And he was offering to turn everything over to the parent company, including the Fanta formula and all accumulated profits. Coca-Cola made a pragmatic decision. They kept Max Keith in charge of German operations. They took control of the Fanta formula, and they quietly let the drink fade away. For the next decade and a half, Fanta effectively disappeared. It was not marketed. It was not produced in significant quantities. The company, rebuilding its international operations in the post-war world, had no interest in a soft drink associated with the Third Reich. Keith remained with Coca-Cola until 1966, rebuilding the German operation into one of the company's most successful international markets. He received numerous honors from the company, including being named to its board of directors. When he died in 1976, Coca-Cola's official obituary praised his courage and foresight in preserving the company's German operations during the war. The obituary did not mention his Nazi Party membership. The post-war years in Germany were marked by the economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, that transformed the devastated Western zones into a prosperous, democratic state. The Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into European reconstruction. Ludwig Erhard's economic reforms freed the market. By the mid-1950s, West Germany was booming. The Eastern Zone, under Soviet control, became the German Democratic Republic, a communist state locked behind the Iron Curtain. Berlin remained divided, and in 1961, the communists built a wall through its heart, creating the most visible symbol of the Cold War. Coca-Cola thrived in this new Germany, particularly in the prosperous West. The drink became a symbol of American culture and freedom, a small liquid reminder that Germany, or at least half of it, had rejoined the democratic world. And in corporate headquarters in Atlanta, executives occasionally discussed what to do with the old Fanta formula, gathering dust in their files. In the mid-1950s, Coca-Cola faced a strategic problem. The company had successfully expanded across the world, establishing bottling operations on every continent. Coca-Cola itself was ubiquitous, its red and white logo recognizable from New York to Tokyo. But the soft drink market was becoming increasingly competitive and fragmented. Pepsi-Cola, long Coca-Cola's also-ran competitor, was gaining market share with its Pepsi Generation campaign. And more significantly, consumers were developing tastes for beverages other than cola: fruit-flavored sodas, citrus drinks, root beer, ginger ale. Coca-Cola needed to expand beyond its flagship product. The company had experimented with other beverages before. Fanta was not the only non-cola drink in its history, but none had achieved significant success. The company was essentially a one-product giant, and that carried risks. If consumer tastes shifted away from cola, Coca-Cola could face serious trouble. In 1955, the company decided to revive Fanta, but this would be a complete reinvention. The original German formula, that mixture of apple pomace and whey created from wartime scraps, would be discarded entirely. The new Fanta would be a premium fruit-flavored soda designed to appeal to international tastes. Most importantly, it would have absolutely no connection, in the public mind, to Nazi Germany. The new formula was developed in Italy, significantly. The company's Italian bottling operation had been experimenting with orange-flavored sodas, capitalizing on Italy's abundant citrus production. Italian consumers loved orange soda. It was refreshing, it paired well with food, and it felt naturally Mediterranean. The new Fanta Orange, based on these Italian experiments, was launched in 1955 in Naples. The choice of Italy as Fanta's birthplace was symbolically important. Italy had been Mussolini's fascist state, Germany's primary ally during World War II. But by 1955, Italy had thoroughly transformed itself. It was a democracy, a founding member of NATO, a key American ally in the Cold War. It was famous for fashion, cinema, art, and food, la dolce vita, the sweet life. Italy represented rehabilitation, the possibility of moving beyond a dark past. And orange soda, bubbling and bright, seemed to embody this optimism. Fanta Orange was an immediate success in Italy. The company rapidly expanded production throughout Europe. Each country got its own variant, lemon Fanta in some markets, exotic fruit flavors in others. The brand's marketing emphasized fun, youth, and carefree enjoyment. The advertisements showed young people on beaches, at parties, living vibrant lives full of color and energy. There was no hint of the drink's actual origins, no mention of wartime Germany, no acknowledgement that the name had once belonged to a beverage created from the scraps of the Third Reich. By 1960, Fanta was being sold in dozens of countries. It was particularly successful in Europe, Latin America, and parts of Africa. The brand had been completely divorced from its past, reborn as a symbol of modern consumer culture. And this transformation was so complete that within a generation, almost no one remembered, or never knew, where Fanta actually came from. Fanta finally arrived in the United States in 1960, 15 years after the end of World War II, and 5 years after its European relaunch. The American soft drink market was the most competitive in the world. Coca-Cola and Pepsi dominated, but there were dozens of regional brands, fruit-flavored sodas, and specialty beverages. Orange soda already existed in America. Brands like Orange Crush, Nahai, and Sunkist competed for market share. But Coca-Cola had a massive distribution advantage. Every Coca-Cola bottler in America could add Fanta to their production line with minimal effort. The company launched an aggressive marketing campaign positioning Fanta as the fun, playful alternative to serious cola. The tagline, "Want a Fanta?" became ubiquitous. Television commercials showed teenagers dancing and playing, always with a bottle of bright orange Fanta in hand. The American version of Fanta tasted noticeably different from its European counterpart. American consumers preferred sweeter beverages, so the US formula contained more high-fructose corn syrup. The orange flavor was more intense, almost artificial in its brightness, but it worked. Fanta gained a foothold in the American market, never threatening Coca-Cola's dominance, but establishing itself as a solid third-tier product. During these decades, as Fanta spread across the globe, the full truth about its origins remained largely hidden. A few historians and journalists had discovered the story. Documents existed, records had been preserved, but it was not widely known. Coca-Cola, when asked, acknowledged that a beverage called Fanta had been produced in Germany during the war, but emphasized that it was a completely different product from the modern brand. This was technically true. The formulas were entirely different, but it obscured the continuity of the name and the corporate structure. The 1960s and 1970s were boom years for the soft drink industry. Rising prosperity, the youth culture revolution, and the expansion of fast food chains created enormous demand for carbonated beverages. Coca-Cola expanded aggressively, entering new markets as decolonization opened up Africa and Asia. Pepsi kept pace, positioning itself as the choice of the younger generation. And Fanta tagged along, the fun little sibling, cheerful and uncontroversial. But history has a way of resurfacing. In the 1980s and 1990s, as archives opened and historians gained access to previously classified documents, the full extent of American corporate collaboration with Nazi Germany began to emerge. Books and articles documented how Ford and General Motors had built trucks for the Wehrmacht, how IBM's punch card systems had been used to organize the Holocaust, how American banks had financed German rearmament. The story of Coca-Cola in Nazi Germany, including the creation of Fanta, became part of this larger narrative. The revelations were uncomfortable for Coca-Cola. The company was America's most iconic brand, a symbol of freedom and democracy exported worldwide. The idea that it had continued operating in Nazi Germany, that it had created a product specifically for the Third Reich, that it had profited from those operations. All of this contradicted the company's carefully cultivated image. Coca-Cola's response was to emphasize several points. First, that the company had lost control of its German subsidiary during the war, that Max Keith had operated independently out of necessity. Second, that the original Fanta formula bore no resemblance to the modern product, that they were effectively different beverages, sharing only a name. Third, that Keith had preserved the company's assets not out of Nazi sympathy, but out of loyalty to Coca-Cola, and that he had turned everything over to the parent company as soon as contact was re-established. These arguments had some validity. The communication breakdown between Atlanta and Berlin was real. The modern Fanta is genuinely a different beverage, and Keith's motivations were likely more commercial than ideological. But the uncomfortable truth remained. Coca-Cola had maintained operations in Nazi Germany throughout the war, had created a product for that market, and had profited from it. The company had, in the sanitized language of business, successfully navigated a challenging geopolitical environment. By the 1990s, this history had become one of those uncomfortable facts that people occasionally remembered and then forgot again. It would surface periodically in articles or books about corporate behavior during World War II, would generate a brief flurry of attention, and then fade back into obscurity. Fanta continued to be marketed as a fun, youth-oriented beverage, its advertisements showing sun-drenched beaches and laughing teenagers. The cognitive dissonance between the drink's origins and its image was almost perfect. The end of the 20th century saw Fanta established as a permanent part of the global beverage landscape. It was the world's second-largest fruit-flavored soft drink, sold in over 180 countries, available in dozens of flavors. In some markets, particularly in Europe and Latin America, it was more popular than Coca-Cola itself. The brand had achieved something remarkable. It had completely transcended its origins, becoming so far removed from its creation story that the two seemed to exist in separate realities. The 21st century brought new challenges and transformations for the soft drink industry. Health concerns about sugar and obesity led to declining soda consumption in developed markets. The rise of energy drinks, flavored waters, and premium beverages fragmented the market further. Coca-Cola, along with every other beverage company, had to adapt to a world where consumers increasingly viewed sugary sodas as unhealthy indulgences rather than everyday refreshments. Fanta adapted by diversifying. The brand introduced Fanta Zero, a sugar-free version. It launched dozens of new flavors targeting specific regional markets. Fanta Green Apple in Japan, Fanta Pineapple in the Caribbean, Fanta Berry in North America, Fanta Grapefruit in Europe. Each flavor was carefully calibrated to local tastes, making Fanta one of the most internationally diverse brands in the Coca-Cola portfolio. The marketing evolved as well. Fanta positioned itself as the drink of bold self-expression, encouraging consumers to live life to the fullest and choose your own adventure. The advertisements featured bright colors, energetic music, and diverse casts of young people doing exciting things. It was all very contemporary, very global, very removed from any association with mid-century Europe. And yet, periodically, the origin story would resurface. In 2015, Coca-Cola made a spectacularly misjudged decision to launch an anniversary campaign in Germany celebrating 75 years of Fanta. The advertisements featured a nostalgic look at Germany in the 1940s, with imagery of vintage bottles and references to the good old times. The campaign carefully avoided any explicit mention of Nazis or the war, but the implication was clear. Fanta was celebrating its birth in 1940. The backlash was immediate and severe. Jewish groups, historians, and social media users condemned the campaign as tone-deaf at best and offensive at worst. The idea of celebrating the good old times of 1940s Germany, the era of the Holocaust, total war, and Nazi atrocities, was indefensible. Coca-Cola quickly pulled the campaign, apologized, and released a statement clarifying that Fanta was created during a time of great hardship, and that the company deeply regrets any offense. The incident revealed the fundamental tension that would always exist for Fanta. The drink's origins are an inescapable historical fact. It was created in and for Nazi Germany, using ingredients available in the wartime Third Reich to keep Coca-Cola's German operations profitable, while the regime carried out the worst crimes in human history. This is simply what happened. No amount of rebranding, no decades of cheerful advertisements, no introduction of new flavors could erase this origin story. But the incident also revealed how completely the modern brand had separated from its past. For most of Fanta's global consumers, hundreds of millions of people across every continent, the drink has no association with World War II or Nazi Germany. It is simply an orange soda, one option among many in the beverage aisle. A child in Lagos drinking Fanta Orange, a teenager in Sao Paulo choosing Fanta Grape, a family in Bangkok sharing Fanta Strawberry. None of them are thinking about 1940s Berlin or Max Keith or the machinery of the Third Reich. They are thinking about taste, refreshment, perhaps the clever advertisement they saw on television. The product has achieved a form of corporate reincarnation, where the current entity shares a name and lineage with its predecessor, but exists in an entirely different moral and cultural universe. This raises uncomfortable questions about corporate memory and responsibility. Does a company bear perpetual responsibility for decisions made under extraordinary circumstances decades ago? Should consumers care about the wartime origins of products they use today? At what point does a sufficient transformation occur that the past becomes merely historical curiosity rather than moral indictment? Coca-Cola's position has evolved into what might be called acknowledgement without emphasis. The company does not deny Fanta's origins. The historical record is too clear for that. When directly asked by journalists or historians, company representatives confirm that a beverage called Fanta was created in Germany in 1940 due to wartime supply disruptions. But they emphasize the discontinuity, different formula, different purpose, different world. The modern Fanta in this telling is a post-war creation that happened to inherit a name from a wartime expedient. This approach has generally been successful in containing controversy. Most consumers, even when they learn about Fanta's origins, do not significantly change their purchasing behavior. The connection feels too distant, too abstract. The orange liquid in the plastic bottle bears no visible trace of its genealogy. It is sweet, cold, and orange-flavored, a simple transaction in the marketplace of beverages. By 2020, Fanta had become a multi-billion-dollar brand, the fourth largest soft drink in the world by volume after Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Diet Coke. It was particularly dominant in certain markets. In Germany, ironically, it remained more popular than Pepsi. In several African nations, it outsold Coca-Cola itself. In Japan, the bewildering variety of limited edition Fanta flavors, melon, lychee, banana, even mystery flavors that changed seasonally, had created a collector culture around the brand. The COVID-19 pandemic, which emerged in late 2019 and swept across the world in 2020, disrupted the soft drink industry like everything else. Lockdowns closed restaurants and theaters, eliminating major consumption venues. Supply chains buckled under the strain of global restrictions. Consumer behavior shifted dramatically toward grocery stores and online ordering. Yet even this disruption proved temporary. By 2021, as vaccines rolled out and economies reopened, soft drink consumption rebounded. Fanta, with its diverse flavor portfolio and strong presence in home consumption markets, weathered the crisis successfully. The brand continued to evolve its marketing strategy for contemporary audiences. Sustainability became a major theme. Coca-Cola pledged to make all its packaging recyclable by 2025 and to use at least 50% recycled material in bottles by 2030. Fanta advertisements emphasized environmental responsibility alongside the traditional themes of fun and self-expression. The disconnect between these progressive, forward-looking messages and the brand's origins in a regime that represented the absolute negation of environmental and human ethics was never directly addressed. It simply existed as an unspoken historical irony. To understand Fanta's journey from Nazi Germany to global phenomenon, we must grapple with larger questions about how commerce intersects with morality, how corporations navigate ethical crises, and how products become divorced from the circumstances of their creation. The story of Fanta is, in many ways, the story of capitalism's adaptability, its ability to survive, transform, and thrive regardless of political systems or moral frameworks. The same corporate structure that operated efficiently in Nazi Germany adapted seamlessly to post-war democracy, then to the consumer culture of the late 20th century, then to the globalized digital marketplace of the 21st century. The corporation's fundamental purpose, to sell beverages and generate profit, remained constant even as the world transformed around it. Max Keith, the man at the center of this story, embodied this corporate adaptability. He joined the Nazi Party not out of ideological fervor, but out of pragmatic necessity. He created Fanta not as a gesture of support for the regime, but as a solution to a business problem. After the war, he served democratic West Germany with the same efficiency he had shown serving the Third Reich. His loyalty was ultimately to Coca-Cola, to the abstract entity of the corporation, which transcended national boundaries and political systems. This raises a question that haunts much of 20th century history. What does it mean to be complicit? Keith did not design death camps or participate in military atrocities. He made and sold soft drinks. He kept his workers employed. He preserved corporate assets. From a certain perspective, these were morally neutral actions. People needed jobs, people wanted beverages, business continued. But this business continued within and financially supported one of history's most murderous regimes. The trucks that delivered Fanta drove on roads built by slave labor. The workers who bottled the drink lived in a society that had expelled or murdered its Jewish population. The profits Keith accumulated were denominated in Reichsmarks, the currency of genocide. Yet to hold Keith, or Coca-Cola, uniquely responsible seems insufficient. Thousands of German businesses operated throughout the Nazi period. International corporations from many countries maintained German operations. The German people themselves, the vast majority of whom were not party members and did not personally commit atrocities, nonetheless went to work, bought groceries, raised children, and lived their lives within the Nazi system. The entirety of German society was, in some sense, complicit simply by continuing to exist and function. This does not excuse individual choices or corporate decisions, but it complicates the moral calculus. The transformation of Fanta from wartime expedient to global brand also illuminates how historical memory works and fails to work in consumer culture. Products are marketed in an eternal present tense. Advertisements show us the life we could have, the person we could become, if only we purchase the right beverage. This forward-looking, aspirational messaging leaves no room for historical complexity or moral ambiguity. The orange soda in the commercial exists outside of time, unconnected to any particular moment or place. It is simply orange, refreshing, and fun. This amnesia is not accidental. It is carefully constructed through marketing, branding, and the corporate management of historical narrative. When Coca-Cola relaunched Fanta in 1955, the company made a deliberate choice to sever the new product from its predecessor. New formula, new marketing, new story. The decision was understandable from a business perspective. Who would want to buy a drink associated with Nazi Germany? But it created a strange historical bifurcation where the name, Fanta, has two almost completely separate meanings depending on which era you're discussing. Historians and ethicists have debated whether this corporate strategy constitutes a form of historical erasure or simply practical business sense. Some argue that Coca-Cola has a responsibility to more prominently acknowledge Fanta's origins, perhaps including historical information in museum displays or company literature. Others contend that the modern product is sufficiently different that extensive historical disclosure would be misleading and unnecessarily burden current consumers with guilt over events they had no part in. Fanta is not unique in having problematic origins that were later obscured or forgotten. The history of 20th century commerce is filled with similar cases of corporations that collaborated with, profited from, or were birthed by authoritarian regimes. Volkswagen, the people's car, was literally created by the Nazi regime as part of its promise to bring automobile ownership to ordinary Germans. Ferdinand Porsche designed the original Beetle under contract from Hitler himself. The Volkswagen factory was built using forced labor, and during the war, it produced military vehicles using concentration camp workers. Yet after 1945, Volkswagen became a symbol of German economic recovery. and by the 1960s, the Beetle was a countercultural icon in America, driven by hippies and free spirits who likely had no idea of the car's origins. Today, Volkswagen is one of the world's largest automobile manufacturers, and its Nazi past is acknowledged but rarely emphasized. Hugo Boss, the fashion company, manufactured Nazi uniforms during the war, including the distinctive black SS uniforms. The company's founder was a Nazi Party member who used forced labor in his factories. After the war, Hugo Boss transitioned to civilian fashion and became a luxury brand associated with sophistication and style. In 1997, the company finally acknowledged its Nazi past and contributed to a compensation fund for forced laborers, but this history remains largely unknown to consumers buying Hugo Boss suits. Bayer, the pharmaceutical giant, was part of IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that produced Zyklon B gas for the death camps and operated a synthetic rubber factory at Auschwitz, using concentration camp labor. After the war, IG Farben was broken up by the Allies, and Bayer re-emerged as an independent company. Today, Bayer is best known for aspirin and is one of the world's leading pharmaceutical companies. The connection to IG Farben is historical record, but not part of the company's public identity. IBM maintained operations in Nazi Germany through its German subsidiary, Die Hamag, which provided the punch card systems used to organize the Holocaust, tracking prisoners, organizing deportation schedules, and managing the logistics of genocide with mechanical efficiency. IBM's leadership in New York maintained contact with the German subsidiary through intermediaries, even during the war. After 1945, IBM became the dominant force in computing and a symbol of American technological prowess. The company's role in facilitating the Holocaust remained largely unknown until historian Edwin Black's 2001 book, IBM and the Holocaust, brought it to wider attention. These cases share common patterns with Fanta's story, corporate pragmatism during the Nazi era, post-war rehabilitation and transformation, the emergence of new brand identities disconnected from wartime activities, and eventual historical reckonings that acknowledged past actions without fundamentally damaging current business. They suggest that the Fanta case is not an aberration, but rather an example of a broader phenomenon: the ability of corporations to survive moral catastrophes and emerge on the other side with new identities. What distinguishes these companies from ones that disappeared is often a combination of factors: the degree of direct involvement in atrocities, being a supplier or beneficiary versus being a perpetrator, the ability to claim they were just doing business rather than ideologically committed to Nazism, the value of their assets and expertise in the post-war reconstruction, and the Cold War realities that made a prosperous, anti-communist West Germany more important than thorough denazification of its business sector. This brings us to a fundamental question that extends far beyond soft drinks. To what extent should the origins of a product influence our decision to consume it today? One perspective holds that origins matter absolutely. A product created by and for a genocidal regime carries an indelible moral stain. To consume it, even if the formula has changed, even if the political context is completely different, even if none of the original actors remain, is to participate, however distantly, in that history. From this viewpoint, Fanta should perhaps not exist at all, or at minimum should carry prominent acknowledgement of its origins, much like how Germany maintains concentration camps as memorial sites rather than allowing that land to be redeveloped for other purposes. Another perspective argues for moral statute of limitations. Enough time has passed, enough has changed, that holding current products responsible for wartime origins serves no useful purpose. The people who made the original Fanta are dead. The regime it was created for was destroyed 75 years ago. The formula is different. The company ownership has changed. The workers producing it today had no part in those historical events. To burden them, or consumers, with guilt over events that happened before they were born seems both impractical and unjust. A third perspective focuses on corporate accountability rather than consumer choice. In this view, the responsibility lies with Coca-Cola to properly acknowledge, document, and learn from this history. The company should fund historical research, contribute to Holocaust education, and ensure that the story of Fanta's origins is preserved and taught. But individual consumers should not be expected to carry this burden in their everyday purchasing decisions. After all, we would struggle to function in modern society if we traced the complete ethical history of every product we consume. There is also the question of what, exactly, we are consuming when we buy Fanta today. Are we consuming the beverage, the physical liquid with its specific chemical composition? Or are we consuming the brand, the accumulation of associations, memories, and meanings that have accrued around that name? The liquid itself is morally neutral. Atoms of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen arranged in patterns of sugar, water, and artificial flavor carry no ethical weight. But the brand, the name, the corporate entity, these are human constructions, and human constructions can bear moral significance. Yet even brand identity is not static. The Fanta brand of 2025 shares almost nothing with the Fanta brand of 1941 except a name. The associations are completely different. The target audience is different. The cultural meaning is different. At what point does a brand become so transformed that it effectively becomes a new entity? Is there a ship of Theseus problem here, where if you replace every component of something, is it still the same thing? These are not merely academic questions. They go to the heart of how we navigate a world where virtually everything we consume has some complex, often troubling history. The coffee we drink was likely grown on land stolen from indigenous people. The electronics we use contain minerals mined in conflict zones. The clothes we wear were probably made in factories with exploitative labor practices. The gasoline in our cars comes from companies with records of environmental destruction and support for authoritarian regimes. If we boycotted every product with ethical problems in its supply chain or history, we would struggle to live in modern civilization. This is not an argument for moral relativism or for ignoring history. Rather, it is an acknowledgement that ethical consumption under contemporary capitalism is extraordinarily complex. We make compromises constantly, often without awareness. The visibility of Fanta's Nazi origins, the fact that we know this story and can discuss it, actually makes it an easier ethical case than the countless products whose problematic histories remain hidden. One of the striking aspects of Fanta's story is how thoroughly it was forgotten, then remembered, then largely forgotten again in the public consciousness. This cyclical pattern of memory reveals something important about how societies process uncomfortable truths. In the immediate post-war years, few people outside Coca-Cola's corporate structure knew the full story of Fanta's creation. The drink was not widely marketed, and the details of wartime business operations were not subjects of popular interest. Germany itself was focused on survival and reconstruction, not on examining the compromises and collaborations of the Nazi era. This was the period of what Germans later called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, struggling to come to terms with the past. But much of that struggle involved silence and avoidance. The 1960s and 1970s brought a new generation of Germans who demanded honest reckoning with their parents' and grandparents' generation. Student movements, historical research, and public trials brought Nazi crimes back into public discourse. But Fanta, being such a minor element in the vast machinery of the Third Reich, remained largely beneath notice. Historians were documenting the Holocaust, the war crimes, the deportations. A soft drink was hardly worth mentioning. The 1980s and 1990s saw the first serious historical investigations into corporate behavior during the Nazi era. This was when books began documenting Ford's German operations, General Motors truck production for the Wehrmacht, and similar cases. Fanta's story emerged as part of this research, mentioned in academic works and occasionally in journalism. But it never became a major scandal. Perhaps because no one died from drinking Fanta, because the product itself was not directly involved in atrocities, it seemed like a minor footnote rather than a damning revelation. The Internet age changed the dynamics of historical memory. Information that might previously have remained in academic journals or specialized books became instantly accessible to anyone with a search engine. Blog posts, Wikipedia articles, YouTube videos. Fanta's Nazi origins became common knowledge among a certain type of historically informed Internet user, the kind of person who accumulates unusual historical facts and shares them on social media. This created a strange bifurcation in public knowledge. Among people interested in World War II history or corporate ethics, Fanta's origins were well known, often cited, occasionally debated. But among the general beverage-consuming public, awareness remained low. Polls and surveys conducted in various countries consistently showed that fewer than 10% of consumers were aware of any connection between Fanta and Nazi Germany. The information was available, but most people had no reason to seek it out. Coca-Cola's approach to this situation has been what corporate communications specialists call passive disclosure. The company does not proactively advertise Fanta's origins, does not include the history in its marketing materials or brand storytelling. But neither does it actively suppress the information or deny it when asked. The relevant facts are acknowledged in company histories and can be found by anyone who looks. This middle path, neither hiding nor highlighting, has proven effective at managing what could be a serious public relations problem. The question remains whether this approach constitutes adequate corporate responsibility. Some critics argue that Coca-Cola should do more, perhaps establishing a historical foundation, funding Holocaust education, or including brief historical notes in Fanta marketing materials acknowledging the brand's origins. Supporters of the company's approach counter that such actions would be performative rather than substantive, that they would burden consumers with historical guilt for no practical purpose, and that the discontinuity between the original and modern Fanta makes extensive acknowledgement unnecessary. In recent years, Fanta's Nazi origins have taken on a curious existence in popular culture, particularly in Internet subcultures and meme communities. The information is known widely enough to be referenced, but distant enough to be treated with dark humor rather than moral outrage. Memes showing Fanta bottles with ironic captions about the Third Reich circulate on social media platforms. Stand-up comedians make jokes about the incongruity of a fun, bright orange drink having such dark origins. The history has become material for ironic commentary rather than serious ethical reflection. This phenomenon reveals something about how contemporary culture processes historical atrocity. For generations born decades after World War II, the Third Reich exists as history rather than living memory. The emotional weight carried by survivors and their immediate descendants has dissipated through generational distance. This does not mean the Holocaust is forgotten or diminished. Holocaust education and remembrance remain strong, but the relationship to that history has changed. It can now be referenced, ironically and darkly, in ways that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. Fanta has appeared in this context in various creative works. Films and television shows occasionally include subtle references. A character in a period drama set in 1940s Germany drinking Fanta, a knowing wink to informed viewers. Historical fiction novels mention the drink as atmospheric detail. YouTube history channels produce mini-documentaries about Fanta's origins, accumulating millions of views. The story has become part of the cultural repertoire of interesting historical facts, filed alongside other surprising corporate histories. There is something unsettling about this transformation of history into trivia. The creation of Fanta occurred during one of humanity's darkest periods, in a nation perpetrating genocide. Yet the story is now often told as an interesting corporate anecdote, a surprising fact to share at parties. The moral weight has been replaced by cultural currency. Knowing about Fanta's origins becomes a mark of being historically informed, of being the kind of person who knows unusual facts. This is perhaps inevitable given the passage of time and the nature of how information circulates in contemporary culture. Everything becomes content. Every historical event becomes material for documentation, discussion, and entertainment. The Holocaust itself has been depicted in countless films, books, and television shows, some serious and respectful, others exploitative and trivializing. Fanta's small role in this history follows a similar pattern. It becomes something to know about rather than something that necessarily changes behavior or understanding. While Fanta's historical origins remain a subject of occasional discussion in Western markets, the brand's most significant growth in recent decades has come from emerging economies where this history holds even less cultural significance. In Africa, Fanta has become one of the continent's most popular beverages. Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, in these nations and dozens of others, Fanta outsells many competing brands. The drink is affordable, widely available, and associated with celebration and socializing. In some African markets, offering Fanta to guests is a standard gesture of hospitality. The brand has become thoroughly localized, with flavors and marketing adapted to regional preferences. For African consumers, Fanta has no connection to European history. It is simply a refreshing orange soda, one of many consumer products that arrived as African nations gained independence and opened to global commerce. The drink's Nazi origins, even when known, register as distant European history with no relevance to African experience. This geographical and cultural distance from the original context allows the product to exist in a completely different framework of meaning. Similar patterns exist in Asia and Latin America. In India, Fanta competes with local brands like Thumbs Up and Limca. In China, It has adapted to local tastes with flavors like white peach and lychee. In Brazil and Mexico, it has become part of the everyday landscape of refreshment. For billions of consumers in these markets, Fanta is simply part of the vast, generic world of multinational consumer brands, as historically neutral as any other beverage. This raises interesting questions about how historical responsibility functions in a globalized world. Should consumers in Lagos or Mumbai or Sao Paulo care about events that occurred in 1940s Berlin? Do corporations have a responsibility to educate all global consumers about historical controversies? Or is it acceptable for products to mean different things in different cultural contexts? There is no clear answer to these questions. On one hand, the Holocaust was a crime against humanity, not merely a European event. Its lessons about racism, authoritarianism, and industrial murder have universal relevance. On the other hand, expecting consumers in countries that had no involvement in World War II to carry the burden of European historical guilt seems like a form of cultural imperialism. The question of whether to drink Fanta presumably has different moral weight in Berlin than in Beijing. Coca-Cola's strategy has been to allow Fanta to be whatever local markets want it to be. In Germany, the brand is somewhat more subdued, perhaps unconsciously affected by awareness of its origins. In other markets, it is aggressively cheerful, colorful, and loud. This flexibility, this ability to mean different things in different places, is both a marketing strength and an ethical complication. It means the brand can succeed globally, but it also means there is no single coherent identity or historical narrative. The sheer variety of Fanta flavors that have been introduced over the decades itself tells a story about corporate identity and historical memory. If Fanta remained only the orange flavor based directly on the wartime formula, its Nazi origins might be impossible to escape. But by proliferating into dozens of flavors, the brand has diversified its identity beyond any single historical moment. Fanta currently exists in over 90 different flavors worldwide, though not all are available in all markets. There is Fanta grape, strawberry, pineapple, apple, fruit punch, peach, mango, lemon, lime, grapefruit, berry, melon, banana, kiwi, elderflower, and countless limited edition and regional variants. In Japan alone, there have been more than 50 different Fanta flavors, including exotic options like Fanta Hip Hop, Fanta Genius Energy, and Fanta Mystery, where the flavor was intentionally not revealed on the packaging. This product proliferation serves multiple purposes. Commercially, it allows the brand to appeal to diverse taste preferences and create novelty that drives repeat purchases. Culturally, it makes Fanta less about any specific flavor or formula and more about the general concept of fruit-flavored refreshment. And historically, it further distances the modern brand from its origins. The Fanta of 1941 was one specific beverage created from wartime scarcity. The Fanta of 2025 is a sprawling family of products united by a name and little else. Each new flavor, each limited edition, each regional variant adds another layer of separation between the contemporary brand and its historical origin point. Fanta Elderflower, launched in several European markets, has no conceptual or material connection to Nazi Germany. It is a modern beverage designed for contemporary consumers, incorporating current flavor trends. The same name links it to that history, but the product itself is entirely new. This raises a philosophical question. At what point does a brand become so transformed that its origins cease to be relevant? If 90% of Fanta products bear no resemblance to the original 1940 formula, if the brand identity has been completely reconstructed, if the cultural meaning has entirely shifted, does the original history still matter? Or does it persist as a kind of genealogical fact, true but not determinative, relevant for historians but not for consumers? One underexplored aspect of the Fanta story is how Coca-Cola has managed its archives and historical narratives. The company maintains extensive historical collections at its headquarters in Atlanta, including documents, photographs, and artifacts from its global operations throughout the 20th century. These archives include materials related to the German subsidiary and Max Keith, though access to certain documents has been restricted. What corporations choose to preserve, highlight, or suppress in their archives shapes how their histories are told and understood. Coca-Cola's official company history emphasizes innovation, global expansion, and American cultural influence. The creation of Fanta is mentioned, but usually in brief, and with the framing of responding to challenging circumstances, rather than operating within Nazi Germany. This is not falsification. The facts are not denied, but it is selective emphasis, a curation of history that highlights certain elements while minimizing others. Historians who have worked with corporate archives note that what is missing can be as significant as what is present. Documents that might embarrass the company or complicate its preferred narrative sometimes disappear or become difficult to access. In Coca-Cola's case, some researchers have reported challenges in accessing complete records of the German subsidiary's wartime operations, though enough documentation exists in various archives to reconstruct the basic history. The question of corporate responsibility for historical documentation is significant. Companies are not public institutions. They are private entities with no legal obligation to preserve records or make them available to researchers. Yet the largest corporations have shaped global history in profound ways, and their internal documents often contain the only detailed records of significant historical events. When companies restrict access to their archives, they effectively control important aspects of historical knowledge. Coca-Cola has generally been more open than many corporations in this regard. The company has cooperated with historians, allowed publication of books about its history, and acknowledged controversial aspects of its past. But there remains a tension between corporate reputation management and historical transparency. The company wants to be known for its positive contributions, refreshment, happiness, global connection, not for its Nazi-era operations. This tension is not unique to Coca-Cola. Every long-established corporation with a complex history faces similar questions about how to present its past. Some companies have chosen to confront difficult histories directly, establishing museums or educational programs that honestly address past wrongs. Others have taken a minimalist approach, acknowledging problems when pressed, but not proactively highlighting them. Coca-Cola's position falls somewhere in the middle, willing to confirm facts, reluctant to emphasize them. As of 2025, Fanta occupies a solid position in the global soft drink market. It has not challenged Coca-Cola or Pepsi for overall dominance, but within the fruit-flavored soda category, it is a leader. Annual revenues from Fanta sales exceed several $billions. The brand is sold in more than 190 countries. It employs thousands of people directly and supports tens of thousands more through bottling partnerships and distribution networks. The marketing continues to emphasize youth, fun, and bold individuality. The current global campaign, WWII Fanta features diverse young people in colorful, energetic settings. The advertisements are carefully crafted to appeal across cultural boundaries, focused on universal themes of friendship, adventure, and self-expression, rather than anything specific to particular regions or histories. The brand has adapted to contemporary concerns about health and sustainability. Sugar-free and reduced sugar variants are now standard in most markets. The packaging emphasizes recycled materials and environmental responsibility. Coca-Cola has pledged to make its entire beverage portfolio carbon neutral by 2050, and Fanta is part of this commitment. These initiatives position the brand as forward-looking and responsible, addressing the concerns of conscious consumers. Yet the fundamental product remains largely unchanged: sweet, carbonated, fruit-flavored beverages consumed for pleasure rather than nutrition. In an era of increasing health consciousness, where sugary sodas are increasingly viewed as occasional treats rather than everyday beverages, Fanta faces the same challenges as the entire soft drink industry. Consumption is declining in wealthy countries, even as it grows in emerging markets. The industry is adapting through diversification, adding healthier options, acquiring water and tea brands, investing in new beverage technologies. Fanta's future likely involves continuing evolution away from its origins in every sense. More flavors, more variants, more adaptation to local preferences and health trends. The brand will continue to exist, but what it means and what it represents will keep changing. The historical origins will remain a fact, discoverable by anyone interested, but increasingly distant from the lived reality of what the brand represents in contemporary consumer culture. The story of Fanta, spanning from 1940 to the present day, offers several lessons about corporations, history, and memory in the modern world. First, it demonstrates the profound adaptability of corporate structures. Coca-Cola Deutschland survived the Nazi regime, Allied occupation, the division of Germany, reunification, and the transformation to contemporary global capitalism. The corporation as an entity proved more durable than any particular political system. This adaptability is both impressive and troubling. Impressive as a testament to human organizational capacity. Troubling because it suggests that commercial entities can cooperate with virtually any regime regardless of its moral character. Second, it reveals how products can become separated from their origins through time and transformation. The Fanta of 2025 shares little with the Fanta of 1941, except a name. Yet that name creates a continuous thread connecting present to past. This raises questions about identity and continuity. What makes something the same thing across decades of change? Is nominal continuity sufficient, or does substantial continuity of character matter more? Third, it illustrates the power of marketing and branding to shape meaning and memory. Through deliberate choices about how to present Fanta, what to emphasize, what to minimize, what stories to tell, Coca-Cola has largely succeeded in severing the modern brand from its historical origins in public consciousness. This was not accidental. It required consistent effort across decades. The fact that it worked demonstrates how malleable historical memory can be, especially for commercial products. Fourth, it highlights the complexity of assigning moral responsibility across time. Who bears responsibility for Fanta's Nazi origins? Max Keith, who made the decisions. The German workers who produced it. The consumers who bought it. The Coca-Cola executives in Atlanta who tacitly allowed German operations to continue, contemporary Coca-Cola leadership, who inherited this history, current consumers who purchase the product. There are no simple answers, and different ethical frameworks yield different conclusions. Fifth, it shows how geographical and cultural distance affects historical meaning. Fanta's origins matter more in Germany than in Thailand, more in Israel than in Brazil. History is not equally weighted everywhere. This is simultaneously reasonable. Different communities have different relationships to different events, and problematic, as it suggests that historical responsibility can be escaped through geographical expansion. Finally, the Fanta story reminds us that history is always present, even when forgotten or ignored. The orange soda on the shelf at the grocery store carries within it, invisibly, the entire story. The rise of Nazism, the devastation of war, the Holocaust, the occupation, the Reconstruction, the Cold War, globalization, contemporary capitalism. All of this history is compressed into that bright plastic bottle, even though 99% of consumers will never think about it. On a summer day in 2025, a child somewhere in the world, perhaps in Munich, perhaps in Manila, perhaps in Montevideo, reaches into a cooler and pulls out a bottle of Fanta. The liquid inside is cold and sweet and orange. The child opens the bottle, drinks, and smiles. In that moment, the beverage is simply what it is: refreshing, flavorful, satisfying. The child does not think about Max Keith or Nazi Germany or wartime scarcity or corporate ethics or any of the complex history compressed into that bottle. The child simply drinks and enjoys. And in this moment of simple consumption, we see both the complete triumph and the fundamental limitation of corporate transformation. The triumph is that a product has been so thoroughly reinvented that its origins are invisible, that joy and refreshment can emerge from dark beginnings. The limitation is that this invisibility is only possible through a kind of collective forgetting, a decision, individual and cultural, not to let history intrude into the present moment of pleasure. This tension between memory and forgetting, between historical awareness and present experience, between corporate responsibility and consumer freedom, defines not just Fanta, but much of contemporary commercial life. We live in a world where virtually every product carries hidden histories, where supply chains connect us to distant injustices, where simple purchases entangle us in complex ethical webs. We cannot possibly investigate and understand the complete provenance of everything we consume. We would go mad trying. And yet, complete ignorance seems like a form of moral failure, a refusal to acknowledge how deeply implicated we are in histories we did not create but benefit from. Fanta endures. The brand continues. New flavors are developed. New markets are entered. The corporation adapts to changing tastes and values, always flexible, always surviving. And somewhere in Atlanta, in climate-controlled corporate archives, the documents remain, memos and reports and photographs from 1940s Berlin, evidence of how a soft drink was born in the Third Reich. The facts persist, even as their meaning shifts and their relevance fades. History and commerce intertwine, inseparable and yet somehow apart, like the layers of meaning in a simple bottle of orange soda. This is the story of Fanta, a story of survival and transformation, of pragmatism and profit, of how capitalism transcends history while carrying it forever as invisible weight. It is a story without a neat moral conclusion, because commerce itself rarely provides such conclusions. Instead, it offers complications, paradoxes, and the ongoing question of what we owe to history as we live in the present and move toward an unknown future. The bottle is opened. The drink is consumed. The story continues.